We are
Great.
recording.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Hi, I'm Whitney Thompson. I'm the Senior Director for Career and Technical Education for the Community College Board, and welcome to our Summer Faculty Professional Development Series. This is the second of 2 webinars this week. The first was on innovative instructional strategies in an online environment. And now we are following that up with learning a little bit more about assessment in an online and remote environment. And so today we will be hearing from Raymond Lawson from Oakton Community College, as well as Fawn Grandinetti from College of DuPage. And this is going to be an exciting and interactive session. So if you guys are checking email at the same time, I really do encourage you to pay attention, because we're going to be moving into some breakout rooms that I know that they have a lot of really good information for you. So at this point, I am going to turn it over to Raymond and Fawn.
Thank you, Whitney. It's my pleasure to do this webinar on assessment in an online remote environment with Fawn. Assessment is something that is dear to me, because my whole life I work with assessment. So I'm very excited to present this webinar we found. So let's move to the next slide. So before we start, we'd like to actually do a poll to see where you guys are coming from in terms of your knowledge in assessment. And would like you guys the participants to put in the chat room the program that you teach in. So if you are from, let's say, a business department, just write the business. If you teach HVAC or you teach welding, whatever you teach, please put it in the chat room for us, just to gauge where you are coming from. That will help us to target our presentation to your needs. And we'll be doing also a poll, and we'll be prepared. Can we have that poll once they put the program they teach in the chat room? Then we'll go to the poll and start the poll and have some questions for you, and then we'll get to the core of our presentation. So the first question that we have in the poll is to know the elements that you use at your institution. And then the second question is, how long have you been teaching online? And the third question, I think that there is a third question, if I'm not mistaken. Oh,
yeah, sorry, if you can't see it, it says rate your level of assessment experience.
All right, so rate your level of assessment, whether it is a beginner level, intermediate, or advanced level in assessment.
And we'll give it a few seconds.
All right, yeah. Some people put their learning management system inside the chat room. Can you do it through the poll so that we can see the numbers if you haven't done it yet?
So I don't know if you can see it, Ray. It looks like we have 15 of 22 who have finished the poll.
Correct. So 16 out of 22. Can we end it in 1 minute?
Sure.
Yeah.
Or when everybody's done it, whichever comes first.
Okay, so yeah. So for the first question, it looks like we have a variety of learning management system that is used at the different institutions that are represented at this webinar. We have Blackboard, we have Canvas, we have D12, and we have other. I would like to know what those, those category, the category of other represent. It might be Moodle, it might be Sakai, I don't know. But
from the chat box, it looks like we have a Brightspace.
Brightspace is part of the D12. That's
okay.
pretty much the same, yeah. So, yeah, we have the three major elements represented here. So we'll be talking about the three major ones. We'll be kind of talking about those three. And then in terms of the second question, it looks like a lot of people are teaching for the first time. 59% say that they have been teaching online for the first time. So this webinar is a great webinar for you so that you can learn how to do assessment within the online learning environment. And we have 1 to 2 years, about 12% have about 2 years of experience teaching online. And then about 3 to 5 years, we have 24%. So that's great. And in terms of the last questions, rate your level of assessment, we have about 47% who say that they have a beginner level experience of assessments. And then we have 41% intermediate, and then 12% advanced. So those who have the advanced level of assessment experience, I would like those people to really interact in the chat room when we are going through this presentation, because we want to know from your experience, and the participants also would like to know from your experience. And thank you very much for going through for sharing your expertise with us in terms of this polling. And I'm looking at the chat room. It looks like a lot of people are coming from arts, sociology, ECC, math, ESL. We have career services, information technology, adult education, advanced ESL, physics, and people from student affairs also. We have people doing career advising that are also in this webinar. So that's great. I don't see anyone from welding. I don't see anyone from HVAC. I don't see anyone from electronic technology. So that's great. We will be focusing on some of these programs that you guys have put in the chat room. All right, so let's close the chat, the polling, and go back to the presentation. All right, so the objective of this presentation, if I can go back to my screen, the objective of this presentation is basically to explain the assessment and his guiding principle. What is an assessment? When we talk about assessment, what are the guiding principles that should guide us in terms of how to approach assessment in our classroom, especially in our online and remote learning environment? And we want to distinguish between diagnostic, formative, and summative assessment. Those are the three main assessments that we see, and we'll be focusing on each one of those three assessment type, and then give you opportunity to see how you go about doing those different assessments in your classroom, whether it's online or face-to-face. We'll be using the online tool to assess student learning. We'll be talking about how you can use those tools that are part of the internet, digital tool or technology tool to do assessment. And then we'll be actually focusing on the features and tools within the learning management system that can help you to do great assessment in your online classes. All right, so having said that, let's move to the next slide. And I would like to start with some questions to you as participants in this webinar. And when we talk about assessment, there are 4 essential questions that we need to ask ourselves as instructors. And so the first one is, how do students come to our course knowing or thinking that they know? That's a question that we need to ask ourselves, because when we are teaching, we need to see, okay, where the baseline level of our students before they start our class. The second question that we need to we need to ask ourselves is, how can we tell if our students are learning during our learning process, during our teaching process, when we are teaching students? How do we ensure that they are actually learning? What do we need to do? We need to assess in order to answer that questions. And the third question is, what are they thinking at any moment in our classroom, whether it's an online classroom or a face-to-face classroom? So another way to answer that question is through assessment. For you to know what your students are thinking at a given moment in your classroom, whether it's an online class or a face-to-face class, you have to use assessment. And the fourth question is, what did they get out of our class compared to what we wanted them to get out of the class? So basically, with this question, we need to consolidate what the students have learned in our class with what are the expectations of the class, meaning what are the learning objectives of the class. So we need to make sure that the students in our class, through assessment, meet the learning outcomes or the learning objective of our class, of our course. All right, so those 4 questions are questions that you need to keep in mind all the time during the teaching process. Let's go to the next slide. Now, we want to kind of give you a definition of what we mean by assessment, or what the literature mean by assessment. And this definition is coming from Thomas Angelo, who is considered as one of the masters of assessment. And he has written a lot of articles and books. And he published an article entitled Reassessing and Redefining Assessment. And in that article, he defined assessment as an ongoing process aimed at understanding and improving student learning. Let's think a little bit about this statement. Assessment is an ongoing process aimed at understanding and improving student learning. I think that there are 2 or 3 things that we need to keep in mind when it comes to assessment. It has to be an ongoing process. It has to aim to understand and improving student learning. Understand student learning and improving student learning. Those are the 3 main things. Assessment is ongoing. You don't do assessment at the end of a class or at the end of a unit or at the end of a lesson. It has to be ongoing process. So in terms of guiding principle, let's go to the next slide. I don't know if we need to go, yeah. So before we actually get into the guiding principle, and I would like to use the teaching cycle as a framework. And this is very basic, but I always use this graphic to show faculty the importance of the element that we have in the graphics. And the teaching is also the learning cycle. I use this framework all the time. How do we know? How do we know if you want to teach someone something? We need to start with the learning objective of what we want to teach the person. The learning objective or the learning outcomes, or sometimes depending on what you are teaching, it might be the competencies that you want the people to learn or to gain out of the section. And basically put in terms of instructional design is the knowledge, skill, and attitude that you want the student to get out of the learning. So you need to start your teaching process by establishing the learning outcomes or the learning objective of what you want to teach your student. And this is something that we get all the time because it comes with the syllabus that our institution provides to us. And based on the learning, the syllabus that we have a kind of a blueprint in terms of developing the content that the student need to learn. So establishing the learning outcome is the first step. Then what we do as a faculty is to know, to provide to students the learning opportunities or the learning activities that they need to complete. in order to meet those learning outcomes that we have established in our syllabus. So the provision of the learning opportunities and the learning activities is a big part of the teaching and the learning cycle. Now, when you have those two elements established and set up in your course, in order for you to know whether the student meet the learning outcomes through the learning opportunities and activities that you have provided to them, you have to assess them. You have to assess student learning. And that's the third step in that teaching and learning cycle. You have to assess student learning. And the assessment of the student learning should be based on the learning outcome, and also by keeping in mind the learning opportunities and activities that you provided them during your teaching process in order to actually assess them. So you have to base your assessment on the activities and also keeping in mind the learning outcomes. Your work is not done yet. Once you have the assessment, you have this done, now you need to analyze the results of your student learning, of the assessment. And this is one piece that most of the time you don't see a lot of faculty doing. The faculty don't do it because, again, they equate assessment to grading. So once they get a grade, they don't go to the next step in order to actually analyze the results. So the analysis of the result is very important because it allows us in the fourth step to really use the result of our assessment to inform our teaching practice, to inform the student learning, and to make improvement to our teaching methodologies, to our teaching strategies. And by doing so, we are actually helping the students meet the learning outcomes of our content or of our course. So this is a very important process framework that we need to keep in mind all the time. Now, let me go back to the guiding principles. The guiding principle, when we go back to Thomas Angelo, he has established 4 guiding principles, and I call it guiding principle. The first one is that you have to establish a clear, measurable, expected outcome of student learning. And that's where it goes back to the first one that we actually talk about. You want to ensure that students have sufficient opportunities to achieve those outcomes. So the learning activities need to mirror the learning outcome that you want the student to master or to meet. And then the third level is that you have to systematically gather and analyze and interpret evidence to determine how well student learning matches our expectation. And our expectation very often are part of the learning outcome that we set up at the beginning of our teaching process. And the fourth and the last one is that we have to use the results of our assessment, the information, to understand and improve student learning. And a lot of practitioners of assessment, including Angelo and Suski, actually mentioned this in their books. So this is a very important element, and that's the one that we miss all the time. So I'm stressing that a lot because without the analysis of the assessment results, we are not completing the cycle of our teaching process. Let's go to the next slide. When we talk about student assessment, I look at it as I see 2 purposes. The first one is for us to gain, us as a faculty, to gain feedback of what we are teaching. It helps us to know whether we are on track to provide students with the content and the learning that they need to in terms of the course that we are teaching, in terms of the program that we are in. And the second goal of student assessment is to ensure that to know whether learning the learning objectives are met, whether or not. Because when you actually set up your assessment and you map your assessment to your learning outcomes, when students complete those assessments, there is a way for you clearly, you can tell whether the students are meeting the learning objective or not. And then that will give you an opportunity either to go back and provide remediation or to actually help those who are not meeting the outcomes to get better in what you are teaching to them. So I would like to say that assessment is part of a process that identifies what we want students to learn. It provides them with good opportunity to learn those things and then assess whether they have learned those things. And that's something that Suski actually mentioned in the 2009 book about assessment. You have to make sure that you are actually meeting all those three elements. So assessment must be designed so that the tests are worth teaching to. That's another practitioner who say that assessment must be designed so that the tests are worth teaching to. Because the tests, without actually assessing whether the students are meeting the learning objective or not, is not an assessment. And assessment is the process of gathering information about student learning, and evaluation is the act of judging that information or assigning a value to it. And I want this to be clear because oftentimes we equate assessment to grading. Assessment is not grading. The assessment is the process, again, of gathering information about the student learning, and evaluation is the act of judging that information and assigning a value to it. So grading is basically an evaluation of what the students have learned. It's an evaluation. We are assigning a value to what the students have learned, but the assessment helps us gather information about the student learning, what they have actually learned. But the evaluation is just giving a value to what the students have learned and provide them with is judging the actual information. Let's move to the next slide. Okay, so I have been talking about, when I talk about student learning, I'm stressing the importance of aligning the student outcome to the learning activities and the assessment to the learning outcomes. Now, at a higher level, we need to ensure that the course outcomes or the course objective are aligned to the program or mapped to the program discipline, and then align also with the institutional or the general education outcomes or goal of your institution. You have to make sure that everything trickles down all the way to the individual course, from the institution through the program to the course. And this is something that we always need to keep in mind when we are actually doing assessment. Let's go to, again, these are just graphic to show you the importance of learning, the learning outcomes, alignment, and mapping. Most of the time when we do this kind of webinar, depending on the focus, we'll be actually spending a lot of time on this mapping, but we are not going to do that today because we want to really focus the time on talking about the different type of assessment, and we'll get to that. So let's get to the next one, and I will briefly say something about this, and then we'll move, we'll switch to Fan to talk about the other slide that we have. So in terms of learning management system, there are a lot of tools inside the learning management system that we can use to complete or to complete assessment. Now, when we look at the poll that we just did, we noticed that a lot of people are using Blackboard, Canvas, or D12 Brightspace. Those tools has features like discussion board, They have features like assignment, features like quizzes and exam, and features like survey, and features like a polling. And all those features can be used to assess students depending on the type of assessment that you want to conduct. I would like also to mention that it's very important to actually create rubrics when you are doing assessment of your student learning. And this tool, this learning management tool has rubric that you can use. There are rubric that you can design at different level, whether it's for a discussion or for an assignment or a project that the student need to complete within the learning management system. You can create assignments, and those assignments can be anything from a project, a written project, to a hands-on activity that the student need to do and maybe take a picture of it or videotape it and then upload it inside the assignment folder or Dropbox for the faculty to actually grade. And the important, the last statement is again to show you the importance of making sure that when you are setting up your rubric, that you are aligning the learning outcome with the assessment within the rubric. So you need to make sure that the criteria that you use in your rubric are mapped to the learning outcomes. That's the only way that when you are using your rubric, that you can actually assess whether those learning outcomes are met. But let me say something about the rubric. A rubric is a scoring guide, is a chart that describes the criteria that the instructor will use to evaluate student work. So a rubric should list things that are important to the student learning. And there are several types of rubrics that you see in this learning management system. There are checklist rubrics that you can have. There are a rating scale rubric that you can also set up. There are descriptive skill that you can, descriptive rubric that you can set up. There are holistic scoring rubric that you can set up. And there are structured observation guide that you can set up. Those are the different type of rubric that you can use in the online or remote environment to actually assess the learning of your student. Now, I'm going to turn it over to Fawn to continue with the next slides.
Okay, awesome. Thank you, Ray. Just two quick comments actually on what Ray just was talking about. So one about all of those rubric types, right? As Ray was talking about the mapping being able to be its own session, right? Talking about rubrics and building rubrics, all of that could easily be its own session or set of sessions as well. So if you need help with any of that and you don't have resources at your own institution, feel free to reach out to me. I like helping people with that kind of stuff. So, and then the other thing is that on the ICCB webpage, the resource page where you found the link to this webinar, there are some resources at the bottom of our webinar listing. And one of those resources is just a quick page that shows you some links to some of these assessment resources for the big three that we have, the Blackboard, Canvas, and D2L. So we don't have Moodle, for example, on there, but we do have links to creating rubrics and using Blackboard Collaborate and things like that. So just so you know, those resources are posted there as well. Okay, so as Ray mentioned earlier, we're going to talk about 3 different types of assessment, and we're categorizing this in the sense of where does the assessment take place in the learning process. And when we categorize in this way, we talk about diagnostic, formative, and summative. So those are the 3 types that we'll be working through, and we'll get some hands-on time for you to work on these as well. So just note as we're going through these examples that I'm going to share that there are a lot of assessment techniques that can be used for multiple types of assessment. So you'll think, well, is this really formative or summative? It really might depend on how you're using it. The other thing, this is the link to the handouts that I just mentioned. There is another handout there. It says Classroom Assessment Techniques, which is CATS, and that has additional ideas beyond those that I'm sharing in the presentation today. Again, just because of time limitations, I'm only sharing a couple: diagnostic, formative, and summative, but there's a huge listing in that document. And you can also usually just go on Google and say classroom assessment technique for and put your discipline in, and you'll be able to find some additional ideas as well. Okay, so starting with diagnostic assessments. So you might have heard these referred to as something like baseline assessments as well. And the idea here is that we're measuring students' knowledge, skills, and abilities before instruction is actually taking place. So as your students are coming into a particular learning experience, whether it's at the beginning of the class or the beginning of a lesson, it helps you determine where to start that lesson. So where are my students before I even begin instruction? And some examples here, some of which I'll share and some of which are in that handout that is posted, are background knowledge checks, misconception, preconception checks, or icebreakers. So here's an example of a background knowledge check. And as I'm going through this, you'll notice that we did this today, right? We wanted to model some of these examples. So doing the polling at the beginning where we asked questions about what your experience level was, what your LMS was, and so on, that helped us as leaders of this webinar talk through or think through how we would best help you. So it was really helpful for us to know how long you've been teaching online, your level of assessment experience, and so on. And then as I go through these slides, there's going to be a similar table for each one of these, just kind of so you can think through. I have the time commitment that it usually takes for each one of these. So you have that information if you're thinking about doing one of these, benefits, drawbacks, and then some information about doing them online. Okay, so a background knowledge check, again, is just checking in to see what students know beforehand. So I think it's pretty self-explanatory as to what it is, but in addition to helping you as an instructor, it can allow the students to think about the upcoming coursework before instruction begins as well. So it's kind of a metacognitive precursor to the class. Also, there are some drawbacks sometimes. So if a student isn't prepared and you ask some kind of high level questions, then it might make the students really uncomfortable or like they feel like they can't get through the coursework even if they can. So just be really careful about the questions that you're actually asking. So some ways that you can do this online or virtually, if you have Blackboard Collaborate, or if you're using Zoom, and I think a lot of the other ones as well have raise hands, have quizzes or polling. You can do polling in Kahoot. And again, if you haven't seen Kahoot before, a quick web search or reach out to me. I have some resources that I can send to you. And then discussion boards. You can ask questions as an introductory discussion board, and maybe that would take some pressure off some of those students who might be nervous about doing it in person if it's kind of an introductory class. Okay, another example of a diagnostic assessment technique is misconception or preconception checks. So sometimes it might not be that you really want to know about their previous knowledge, but you might be teaching a subject where if they have preconceptions about that subject area, they might have difficulty learning the content. So it helps you really understand what the students are coming in with kind of in a maybe an ethical or prior knowledge sort of way. So I like this example here, this quote from, again, this is Thomas Angelo and Patricia Cross in this case. The greatest obstacle to new learning often is not the student's lack of prior knowledge, but rather the existence of prior knowledge, or what they consider to be prior knowledge, right? So it helps them to think through those issues. Now, if you're teaching one of those classes, now you already know this, right? So students might not respond well to having their certainties questioned. That might be something you need to work through in that class, and you're probably pretty adept at that already, but just think about that. If that's happening in the first week of class, how you might want to deal with that. And then again, fundamental attitudes and beliefs can be difficult to change, but again, I'm thinking if you're teaching something like my background is political science or sociology, something like that, you're probably fairly adept at working through those things with your students. So then for online and virtual, again, Kahoot, your learning management quizzes or surveys, and then doing the same thing in Zoom with quizzes or hand raises. Again, you could do this in discussion boards as well. Okay, so now it's going to be your turn. So we're going to break out into breakout rooms with 3 or 4 people per breakout room. And I'd like you to think through, you can all have a couple minutes before you start talking, think through a diagnostic assessment activity that you could use online or remote in the fall semester. And while you're doing that, think about, can you do this in your LMS? Do you know for sure that your LMS has the capability to do what you're thinking about doing? or, you know, might you want to go outside of the LMS and use something like Kahoot or Quizlet, something along those lines. So I believe we're going to go ahead and break out into those rooms though. So these are the things that you're going to talk about in your group. And then we'll come back and have just a couple minutes to talk as a large group before we move on to the next type of assessment, which is formative assessment.
How many minutes did they have in the breakout?
Let's do, I think we're good if we do 10 minutes.
Okay. And then they need to have elect someone to report back.
Oh, yep, I didn't say that one, but
oh, they left already. Okay.
Yep, I think most of them are.
When they come back, I'm sure
out
that
to their, yeah.
So they would like
They'll
to share.
find out, right?
Yeah, they would like to share. Yeah.
So you should have, if you're still here, you should have gotten an invitation to go to a breakout room. So that's what you're going to want to click and say yes.
I see that. Let me see if someone is asking a question.
Oh, okay. So Susan, that's totally fine. No problem. You can hang out, or if you have questions for us that you want to chat about while everybody's in breakout rooms, that's fine. I did get a private question about providing a link. So, which I can't respond to right now because the person is in a breakout room, and when they're in a breakout room, you can't respond. But help me remember that to mention that the slides are also posted on the website.
Right. Yeah. And I think that's
back.
Okay, it's back now. Okay.
Okay, awesome. So, let me just make sure. Okay, so we should be good to go. Thank you everybody for going to the breakout rooms and having those conversations. We thought we'd give you a couple seconds, a couple minutes to share some of the things that you might have had conversation about. I don't know, I didn't tell you to choose a group leader, so I understand if you don't have someone ready to share, but anybody who is, if you feel like sharing but don't feel like speaking, you can type your thoughts into the chat box as well. And then as you're kind of thinking about what you'd like to share, let me just say, I did get a question about whether these slides will be shared. And yes, the slides are actually already also posted on that same website with all of the rest of the information. So you should be good to go with that, and you should be able to access the examples that I'm sharing in the presentation as well. And the webinar recording will be posted later as well. So, okay, so would anyone like to share your conversation, diagnostic assessment techniques that you talked about, maybe how you're thinking about implementing them in your courses?
They can raise their hands. I think that someone raised their hand.
Okay, so I'm sorry, is it Amke?
Yes, Amke, I'm from Germany.
Okay, Amke, okay.
Thank you. So I was in a group with Carlos and Farzana. I teach foreign languages. Farzana does anatomy physiology. And Carlos, I'm sorry, I forgot because I got a little nervous once we're in that room and it's strangers, a little social anxiety. We talked about issues like anonymous diagnostic assessment. So I work a lot with international students. There is that saving face, the shame, maybe I don't want to share what I don't know because I feel ashamed that I don't know. So we discussed the advantages of using discussion boards versus anonymous polls, and self-assessments. Grade yourself on a, scale from 1 through 5. How comfortable do you feel using APA 7? Or do you understand what an annotated bibliography is as an incoming assessment to see where students are? So that was a lovely conversation.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much. Yes. Okay, great point about, right, not being sure about whether you want to tell everybody who knows what, right? Basically at the beginning of the course. So I think that's true throughout the course, but especially at the diagnostic level, at the front end where people don't know each other, it might make them especially a little nervous to share that information. So the idea of doing that anonymously is a really good point. Thank you so much. Does anyone else like to share?
Can you hear me?
I can.
Yeah,
Okay.
go ahead.
Yeah, well, I brought something up. We didn't quite get to it because, well, the thing is, we're all on different, they're on Blackboard, and I
Yeah.
used to be on Blackboard, now I'm on Canvas. At the other school, I'm on Brightspace. But what I kind of wanted to know was, I usually do an assessment every semester where I do a lot of writing classes. I usually have my students do a little written bio, like a pretty kind of short with just their basic interests and experiences, and also to get a sense of what level they're at and what they want to do. But then I usually have them also share it out loud, so people can find out about themselves and other students. But I'm wondering what the best way to do that would be online, because I really mostly just transferred my assignments to online, and I didn't do too much conferencing or live stuff. I would just record brief descriptions of my assignments sometimes. So how would I have each student do a tape and leave it, like a 5-minute thing or something? Can I do that?
Yes, you can actually do that in an online learning environment. It doesn't matter whether you're on Blackboard, Canvas, or Brightspace, you can do that. Basically, you can have an introductory discussion board, and then in that introduction discussion board, you can actually ask your student either to write their bio, a brief bio, or those who want to record themselves and speaking about themselves can do that. So you give them the opportunity to use the method that they want to actually do the bio. Either is a writing bio or if that is a student talking to a camera. And then they will upload or they will actually post that inside the discussion board, and other students will read them and then comment or add to whatever they want to add. So you can do that. Again, that's what we need to keep in mind, that things that we do in the class, how do we bring those things in the online and remote environment? So it can be done.
Okay, thanks.
Yep. Great, thank you.
How long would they have on the board? Just a couple minutes a piece, or?
And you can, when you set up a board, let's say that at the beginning of your class, again, you are doing this online, which means that you might set up things on a weekly basis in your online class. So you can give the student the first week of the class, you can say, okay, you know what? I want you to post by this date your bio, and then by this date, I want people to read and react to your bio. So you talk to all the students and you say, okay, this is the assignment. The assignment is to go in and on the discussion board, talk about yourself. Or there are other activities that you can also do. Instead of having the student talk about themselves, you can also pair them. You can pair them and ask them, okay, you work with this person and this person will introduce you. You talk to this person and this person will introduce you. You introduce your friend in the classroom, in the virtual classroom, and the other person will interview you, learn more about you, and then talk about you. So have a bio about you, but you talk to your friend. So you can do pair activity. So they'll post it, and then you say, okay, by Wednesday, I want all the students to post their bio introductory discussion. And then by Sunday, I want all the students to react on all the bios that we have in the discussion board. So I think that is better to do it the first week so that you have a sense of who you have in your classroom before you continue with the remaining weeks teaching the content.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out too, Vittorio, that Anka posted in the chat box, if you open, an idea about doing student biographies with mind maps about themselves. So they're mapping, like they make, I'm assuming, like a bubble for education, for work experiences and hobbies and so on. So that might be a really interesting thing for you to try out. And she posted a link there too that you can take a look at if you're interested in, giving them some options as to, you could do a video or a discussion board post or, one of these mind maps or something along those lines. So great. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
And then I want to go ahead and move on because I want to make sure we have plenty of time for all of our assessment types, but we'll have a chance to share again later. So okay, so now we're going to move from diagnostic to formative assessment. So remember, diagnostic was before the learning process, so formative is during the learning process. So really you're looking to see if while you're teaching, students are picking up the information that you're trying to get them to. So some examples here again that I'll share some of, but the others are in that handout. The minute paper, muddiest point, memory matrix, journal. And some of these things like a minute paper, you may be doing already and not realize that it's called a minute paper. Okay, so take a look at those things. The first one that I'll share here today, though, is a graphic organizer. So this is sort of like if you were going to do a mind map, right, about the things that are being learned during the time that you're teaching. So you're going to allow students to give some information about what they already know, and maybe during the learning process, maybe they can add to a graphic organizer as time goes on. Certain graphic organizers, just be aware, you know, we do have students with a variety of disabilities. So if you have students who are not visual learners or might be visually impaired, that you may need to work through that issue with them. I do have a link in here of another source that if you go to this source, they have a lot of different graphic organizers that you can kind of click through and see what might work for you and your students. And then I will say that for online and virtual cases, if you're going to only use a software once for the class, it might not be worth it. So think about all of everything that everyone, instructors and students, are learning right now. So you will have to learn whatever that is, right? But your students also have to learn that. So if you're going to use it, then I would advise that you use it multiple times so that the students aren't learning a brand new program or a brand new system just for one assessment. Another example of a formative assessment here that you might have seen something similar to this before is a memory matrix. So basically it's a table that you're giving them some prompts in the form of usually the titles of rows and the titles of, titles of rows and titles of columns. And then they're filling out information as they go. So here at the bottom of the page, I have just a very basic example of what that might look like in the form of an intro econ class. But you could imagine that you might fill in some of the blanks in the memory matrix as well, but not fill in some of the row or column titles, right? So that's another way that you can use the memory matrix. It's not very complicated for really basic concepts, especially early on in your course. And you can use graphic organizers. You could use Word and Google Docs. You could use, I've used the Whiteboard and Blackboard Collaborate for this purpose. I've put a memory matrix up on the whiteboard in Blackboard Collaborate and just had people type into different blocks as their, like kind of as a large group process. So that's some of the things that, those are some of the things that you can do as well. So I'm going to send you back out. Same thing, okay, so you'll get used to doing this. You're going to go back out into your breakout rooms and have conversations about some of the things that you can do for formative assessment in your online learning environment. And remember, there are you can look through that classroom assessment technique handout that's posted if you need additional ideas, or just talk through these ideas with each other. And I'm looking at the time, I'm thinking 8 minutes, okay? So I wanna make sure we have enough time to talk as a group as well. So they're the same questions, you're just talking about assessments that are taking place during the learning process this time. So Jeff, I think we're all set to go out to our breakout rooms. I'm working with your colleagues in those breakout rooms again, and I'm going to give you a chance to speak again. You can use the chat box or raise your hand or just speak up, either way. What did you learn from your colleagues? What kind of ideas are you thinking about using? Anything you'd like feedback on from the other group and so on, or from the whole group and so on. Oh, and you can start recording, Jeff, sorry.
There is no volunteer.
So Fawn, this is Whitney. So in the previous chat or the previous breakout session, we were talking about the difficulties of in an online environment assessing things that are usually done through demonstration, so demonstration-based assessment, and whether that's formative or summative or even diagnostic, you know, do you have any recommendations for how we can do that, especially, so particularly thinking about CTE areas that usually are online, but now we're sort of forced to be online?
Right, so it's, I'll let Ray talk too, but it's tricky, right, because it depends on your field. So I was just talking with someone recently about when my 15-year-old got put into online learning in March, right? Her her sculpture class turned into essentially a sculpture appreciation class. And I said something like, you know, could we at least have them, you know, get materials and make something and take pictures of it and post it? So that is an option. I think that, you know, at the high school level, they didn't do that because they didn't want parents to have to drive to the store, which may not be open, and get materials, which they may or may not be able to afford. But going into this situation where students now should have some idea of what they're getting themselves into in fall. So that's one thing, like either posting pictures or posting video of yourself doing the actual task at hand might be one way. And another way that's not perfect, it's just simply not, is asking them to describe. So write up, it doesn't have to be something that you're grading the grammar, the English on, but write up the step-by-step procedure that you would use if you were going to complete this task. So again, you're not actually seeing them do that. It's not a perfect solution, but it is something that might be kind of an interim thing that we need to allow students to do in certain circumstances given the COVID situation. Ray, what were you going to share?
I think that you pretty much hit the nail on the head. And in terms of doing a hands-on or performance-based type of assessment, you can use pictures, you can use videos. We know now that many of our students have their cell phone, and all the cell phone have video capability. You can ask them to use their cell phone to take a picture of what they are working on. And then once they have that file, video file, there is a way that they can upload it into the learning management system easily. And so that's one way to do it. And the other way is what Found just described. You know, if they don't have videos, they don't have cell phone, they can actually describe the process that they will use to get to what they are working on in terms of whether it's a sculpture or if it's a student doing welding or maybe art painting or something like that. So many of their faculty are right now, especially when we actually pivoted to a remote teaching environment, a lot of them ask students just to take pictures or videotape what they are doing and then upload it to the learning management system. Yeah, it can be done. Yeah. The technology is out there. If the student doesn't have a cell phone or a computer that has a camera, a webcam embedded in it, the school can provide that. So that's one of the things that we have been doing at our institution. We provide students with computers if they don't have one. We are not providing cell phone because once we provide you with a camera, a computer that has a webcam, you can do everything that you need to do with that computer. So yeah, it can be done, especially in a city program. You just need to use the technology available to you to actually make that happen.
Awesome, thank you. Okay, so I'm looking at the clock, so I'm going to keep going. I want to talk about summative. So summative assessment is the type of assessment that you probably think of when you hear the word assessment, right? So we're measuring what students have learned from a unit or a course or a program. So it's the end point assessment. So these are things that you often think about, like exams or term papers or portfolios, or as we were just actually talking about, performance tasks, right? So performance tasks are basically when we're asking students to provide an example of them actually completing something. So this was a good segue that I had forgotten that we were doing, right? So, so you can ask them to provide a video link or some sort of other evidence that they either have performed a task or that they know how to perform a task. And I understand, right, like there's a difference between someone doing a sculpture at their dining room table and someone fixing their car, right? Or fixing a certain part of their car that you may not want them to go down that road. So again, some examples there that you might be able to use even if they can't share the task themselves is giving the step-by-step of how they might diagnose a problem in a vehicle, or how they might diagnose a problem if something was leaking on a weld or something along those lines, right? And then another thing is portfolios. So hopefully you've all heard about portfolios in some manner. And these might be a little bit harder within a given course. A lot of times portfolios work really well for programs to have students collect information along the time that they are learning. So for a program, it might be at the end of individual courses that they are collecting information or collecting kind of their capstone for that course over time. You could do this in a course as well. So ask students, for example, to share maybe, or start compiling examples of their first, second, third, and fourth art projects within a given course. Now, there are some LMSs that have portfolio built into them. Some of us, like if we have Blackboard, you might have portfolio turned off. So you might need to go to some sort of external source. LinkedIn, for example, has a way of doing portfolios. And then there are some other just kind of website-based portfolio things out there that are free, that if your LMS isn't set up to do portfolios, you can do that as well. Or you could even use Google Docs, right? Ask each student to create a Google Doc with links or embedded pictures of things that they have created. And that's a way that you can do basically free, easy, and 99% of our students know how to use Google Docs. So that's a pretty easy way of dealing with that. So again, I'm gonna let you go out into breakout rooms. I'm looking at the clock. I'm thinking we're just gonna do a quick 6 minutes out this time. So hopefully summative is something you've thought about a lot already. I think you probably don't need quite as much time with your colleagues, but we wanna leave time for you to ask us questions at the end. Ray, go ahead.
I say 4 minutes.
Oh, 4 minutes. Go, 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 go. Okay, we're doing 4 minutes. So go out to your breakout room and I'll see you soon.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, it looks like everybody is back. Thanks, everybody. Sorry about the quick turnaround on that one, but we want to make sure we have time at the end for you to ask any questions that you have of us. So we're going to go ahead and skip talking about summative, but if you want to talk about it in a minute when we have time for Q&A, that would be fine as well. Okay.
Okay, so again, we want to show you this graphic because we want to close the loop. And again, bringing this back to you is basically to remind you that during the teaching cycle and learning cycle, and I hope that during the three type of assessment, diagnostic, formative, and summative, you during the training or during the breakout room, you kept in mind this teaching cycle, because when you are thinking about every single one of those assessments, you have to be thinking about those assessments in terms of this graphic. You have to see how the activities that you are providing your student in terms of learning map to the learning outcomes and the type of assessment that you are providing, and how the result of the assessment can be used to improve your teaching process. And within the learning management system, there are many ways that you can do that. And you have to keep in mind that if you don't use the tool, there's a lot of LMS have tools that we don't always take advantage of. So you have to know and talk to the administrator of the LMS about how you can actually set up learning outcomes or learning objective in your LMS, how you can map your assessment to those learning outcomes through the rubric that you are using, because the rubric need to take into account the learning outcomes as part of the criteria that you are setting up to grade your students. And so when you do those things, when you use the tool that you have inside the LMS, you'll be able to get not only the grade of your student, but you'll be able to also look at the results of those assessments and see whether the students are meeting the learning outcome or not. In Canvas, there is a great tool called Mastery, Learning Mastery, that I don't know if all the institutions that are using Canvas have implemented that tool, but it's a great tool that you can use. And at the end of each assessment, you can tell the number of students that are meeting the outcomes, the number of students that are not meeting the outcomes, the number of students that are below the outcomes, so that you can actually remedy to their learning. So again, for us, we want to bring this back to you so that you know the importance of the teaching and learning cycle and the importance of starting with learning outcomes providing students with assess learning opportunities and assessing the student. And then at the end, make sure that you analyze the assessment, and then you use the result of the assessment to inform your teaching practice. Thank you. Now we'll go into Q&A section because we want to give you an opportunity to ask questions. These are some of the resources that we have used, and you'll see these resources once you get the PowerPoint through ICCB website. Time for Q&A.
Awesome, thanks.
So feel free to grab the mic and talk, or raise your hand, and then we'll ask you to speak. Any questions?
Or anything that you would like to share that you think was really great for your group. Again, thank you for doing that. I hope that you enjoyed meeting some of your colleagues from across the state. I really like doing breakout rooms in that case, because you get to meet people that you wouldn't have otherwise met.
So it's okay if we email you with questions? 'Cause a lot of times things come up as you do the assignments. I mean, you don't think of it when you're talking to people, but then, you know, things come up, you know?
Yeah, feel free to email us. That's the reason why we are doing this. We really want to help out and assist. So if any question come up later on, just feel free to send an email to both of us. Any comment, any input that you guys would like to share, or any feedback? Because again, we practice what we preach. So any feedback, because we need to gain, assessment is to gain feedback and to make sure that the students are actually meeting the learning objectives and the outcomes. So any feedback you'd like to share with us, feel free to speak up. Yeah, we used to do this type of a webinar, so we always like to learn from the participant also, so that we can improve our practices.
I'm going to put something in the chat box. One more resource that you might find interesting. So this is from the K. Patricia Cross Academy. So Patricia Cross was the person who wrote the classroom assessment technique book with Tom Angelo, who we had talked about earlier. So they have a bunch of videos of interesting classroom assessment techniques that you can use that are posted there. And those videos were made pre-COVID, so they might not all specifically address online learning, but there's a lot of good stuff there that you can modify to your own classes. And I think it's a really helpful place to go as well if you're looking for just ideas of more activities to do with your students in class.
It looks like there are no questions to ask.
Okay.
Which means that we met our learning objectives.
So
Right.
again, feel free to email us if other questions come up later, though, because as Vittorio said, I think that you don't always know your questions until you start getting, into the hands-on when you're building your course. So,
that's right.
Okay, thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you, Whitney, for putting this together for us.
Yes.
Yes, thank you all. And remember that we will have discipline-specific discussions next week.